Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. This is IC 97, adding ISO standards to the clinical reasoning process. My name is Stephanie Vasquez, and I am moderating this session today. I will be providing the CU code at the end. Before we get started, please remember to mute yourself during the entire session. Questions can be asked during the chat feature, so please go ahead and enter all your questions at any time using the chat. And now I will be very honored to introduce to the presenters, Kopplin, Stacey, Mullis, and Endsjo. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Stephanie. We're delighted to be here. I'm Kopplin. I am the Director of Regulatory Science for Permobil, and I'm also honored to be the chair of the RESNA Standards Committee for wheelchair and related seating.
And my name is Endsjo. I am the National Education Manager for the Long-Term Care Division as well for Permobil, and I'm happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacey Mullis, and I'm an occupational therapist. I've spent the last 10 years pursuing my passion of educating novice therapists in the area of seating and wheeled mobility. And I'm continuing to do that through my involvement with the Clinician Task Force and other nonprofit organizations.
So thanks so much for joining us today. We're excited to be presenting to you, and we'll be picking up a thread that we've been hearing throughout this conference, and that is the need to really include all of the tools that we have available when we're making decisions about the best wheelchair seating solutions for the client, whether those are technical tools, clinical expertise, finite element modeling, big data. Everything that we have available, we should be utilizing to do better for our users. So we want to share with you the tool of the ISO standards and talk about how that can be incorporated in the decision-making process. I'm the engineer in the group here, so I'll be giving the technical perspective and talk you through some of the standards that have been developed to assess wheelchair seating. We'll also look at how those standards tie to the current clinical practice. And then Anna and Stacey will walk you through how those results can be used and considered. So let's start by talking about the ISO standards themselves. The International Organization for Standardization was founded shortly after World War II as a way for the nations of the world to collaborate on best practices. And since then, there have been over 20,000 international standards that have been developed, all of these with the goal of sharing and utilizing really the best way of doing things, whether it's developing a product or providing a service. There are over 238 technical committees, and all of these standards that are developed are meant to enhance safety, improve quality, ensure reliability, and also help prove the effectiveness of products and solutions. So for our world, there's a specific technical committee within ISO that's dedicated to developing standards for assistive products. And within that technical committee is a subcommittee specifically for wheelchairs. And there are 5 working groups looking at different tests and requirements for wheelchairs and wheelchair seating. And we'll take a look at the wheelchair seating standards today. All of those standards are created internationally by the member countries. And in the US, the membership is through the American National Standards Institute, and the standards are developed at the RESNA level. So this is where we really encourage everyone to participate in this development process. In the RESNA committee, we provide the US perspective on the international standards and tabulate the votes for our country. And then we also consider the ISO standards as we look at what we want to adopt at a national level. And I'm really proud of the committee that we have. We have some extremely active participants that have done a lot to advance the standards. So thanks to all of you who are participating. This is a multidisciplinary effort. And at the ISO level, we have meetings that occur usually 3 times a year. And when we can travel, they're held in different parts of the world to make sure that the perspectives of different regions and cultures are considered, as well as the input of technical people. We have engineers, we have researchers and clinicians, therapists, and different practitioners, as well as regulatory bodies. So having that cross-functional, cross-discipline input helps keep a balance to the standards and make sure that they are both clinically relevant and technically practical. And I think that's a theme that Jean Minkle presented earlier in the conference, that we should be using cross-functional teams in our decision-making, and data should help inform clinical practice. And then clinical practice should inform the regulatory processes. And I want to use that to also emphasize the fact that the ISO standards are voluntary. So as we develop these methods, we do need them to be adopted into clinical practice and then into regulatory requirements so that we can really help advance the solutions we're providing to the wheelchair users. So let's talk about what these standardized bench tests are and what they aren't. So the tests that have been developed are intended to measure key performance characteristics of wheelchair seating, and in this case, specifically the cushions. They are meant to give objective comparisons of properties of the cushions, which can help encourage innovation and also increase confidence in the suitability of a solution. So if there are specific needs for the client that you're looking for, and you know what characteristics you want the cushion to have, you can often turn to the bench test to see how they perform and how they meet those needs. They're not intended to endorse specific solutions or designs or materials. These are objective test measures of performance. So it doesn't matter if that performance is achieved with foam or air or gel or honeycombs. It's all about the end interaction with the client. And the standards typically do not set pass-fail boundaries. These are comparative measures to help you objectively look at those characteristics and just better understand how the cushions perform. And they, last but not least, are never meant to replace clinical reasoning. Again, they're meant to be another tool that can be used in that decision-making process. So when the standards are developed, especially with cushions, we are looking at the clinical needs of the user, and we are informed by the state of clinical practice and especially the current clinical practice guideline. In 2019, the World Authorities on Pressure Injury Prevention, EPUAP, NPIAP, and PPPIA, published the current standard of clinical practice guidelines, which are based on over 3,500 research studies that were reviewed by over 250 international experts and vetted by 1,000 stakeholders, all to really assess what research has been done on pressure injuries, what we understand about them, and how we can best prevent them. And having global agreement and publication of this 400+ page document really gives us an incredible tool to base not only clinical practice on, but also the development of ISO standards. ISO standards should reflect the guidelines that are in this method, and they do. So for starters, the clinical guideline has defined pressure injuries as local damage to the skin and/or underlying tissues as a result of pressure or pressure in combination with shear. And so this gives us a starting point for thinking about how those support surfaces should be interacting with the body to minimize the effects of pressure and shear. It also goes on to emphasize that, of course, individual tolerance is affected by things like microclimate, perfusion, age, health status, comorbidities, and conditions of the soft tissues. And support surfaces play a key role in providing care for prevention of pressure injuries. And that these should be specialized devices, as the guideline says, for pressure redistribution, designed for management of tissue loads, microclimate, and/or other therapeutic functions. And these support surfaces can achieve these end goals by providing immersion, envelopment, and microclimate management. And this can have a significant effect on the care for the person in the wheelchair. But these properties also really vary greatly by devices and across manufacturers and across different approaches. So the guideline points to the standardized tests, that these tests were developed and exist to help quantify these performance characteristics and aid in that decision-making process. So we'll take a look at some of those specific tests and how they mirror the requirements that are spelled out in the guideline. First of all, pressure redistribution. We're all familiar with pressure mapping and how that's used in the clinic. The ISO standards make use of the pressure mapping process, but have applied it in a laboratory setting. So this is part of the aging standard in our ISO guidelines. And by doing pressure mapping in a lab, you can eliminate a lot of the variability that you see in the clinic. So instead of having pressure mapping with different people that are going to present differently and sit differently, you can use a standardized indenter, which is shown in the picture. And this is a set geometry and weight and construction, so that every time you apply the simulated buttocks and thighs to a cushion with a pressure map, you've done your best to eliminate a lot of that variability. And you've converted it into a standardized test that's very reliable across labs. And so this picture in particular was from the University of Pittsburgh and from their testing lab. So we can assess cushions in a laboratory environment and take a look at the type of pressure mapping that we can get. We can compare the contact area and peak pressures and pressure distributions with that method, and that gives us some information. We can then take a look at immersion. The clinical practice guideline goes on to explain that cushion construction can do the pressure redistribution that we're looking for in one of two methods, either with immersion and envelopment or redirection and offloading. And the guideline goes on to explain that the depth of immersion is typically about 40 to 45 millimeters for most people. And that's based on the geometry of the pelvis. So the thought is that the cushion needs to be tall enough and deep enough to immerse the pelvis and support the ITs and the greater trochanters. So that's a nice straightforward measure that's easily applied to a bench test. And that's what's been done in this method. This is ISO 16840-2. And I should back up and say that the ISO 16840 series is where you can find these cushion standards that all relate to pressure management and to stability and aging and vocabulary and so on. So in 16840-2, the immersion test is spelled out. And that test method is based upon those very geometries. You can see there are 4 cylinders in the center that represent the ITs, and there are 2 buttons at the perimeter that represent the greater trochanters. So this indenter is placed on top of the cushion, and a load is applied, and that indenter sinks into the cushion, and you can measure that depth of immersion. And this is a standard that has been adopted by a regulatory body, and that's in the US through the FDA and through CMS. There is a test requirement based upon this method that has drawn a line for skin protection cushions. So if you can pass this test and you can exceed that depth of immersion, that's one of the requirements for being a skin protection cushion in the United States. And if it's not, it's considered a general use cushion. Envelopment is the other method that's described for the way that a cushion can interact with the body to provide that pressure redistribution and skin protection. So we can look at a method to quantify the envelopment of the cushion. The immersion method measured the depth into the cushion, but with envelopment, the ISO standards have developed this method, ISO 16840-12, that takes a buttock-shaped indenture and has an array of sensors embedded in that surface. So when the indenture is applied to the cushion, again, under controlled laboratory conditions with a set geometry and a set load, you can get pressure measurements from each of those sensors and have a better idea not only of how far you're sinking into the cushion, but how well the cushion is immersing and enveloping. Or if it's using offloading, you can also demonstrate that with the data that's returned from this method. Shear is, of course, the other external effect that we're interested in when we're assessing the way a cushion interacts with the body. The clinical guideline is emphasizing the role of shear forces at the interface. It states that elevated shear forces at the interface between the body and a support surface or a medical device can exacerbate the damaging deformations caused by the normal stresses. And minimizing the compressive pressure and the shear loads are valid clinical interventions for reducing the risk of developing pressure injuries. So again, we're just talking about the external measures that we can take, this time in a laboratory with a laboratory test method to assess those shear forces. And of course, as you've learned from other discussions in the conference this week, those shear forces can translate to internal shear stresses and strains that lead to deformation of the tissues, that can lead to cell death and then tissue death. And I encourage you to see some of those presentations, especially those on finite element modeling, that can do some of that analysis. But we're limited to the external measures that we can take. There is a measure within ISO 16840-2 in the annex that describes the shear forces that are involved, called horizontal forces, that can assess how hard it is to drag this same seated indenture, which represents the thighs and buttocks, across a cushion. So that gives you an idea of the forces that are holding the body in place. But we're interested in those measures, but we're also interested in the localized shear forces at the IT region. So while this is not currently an ISO test method, it has been applied by the University of Pittsburgh, and we're considering it as an ISO method. So the ISO 16840-2 has been adapted with this shear sensor that you can see in the lower left-hand corner. And that shear sensor can add that localized data to this pulling data and the bulk effect of the potential sliding of a body across a cushion, and really zero in on what's happening at the interface where that IT would be interacting with the cushion, so that we can think about how that could translate to internal tissue stresses and strains. And then we're, of course, not only concerned with tissue protection and preventing pressure injuries, we're also interested in the stability of the person in the cushion and how that cushion is going to potentially react to just movement throughout the day and different ADLs. So recently, a new standard was developed in response to this need. Of course, we want a cushion that is acceptable for the individual and minimizes the pressures and shear exerted on the skin and soft tissues, especially in those high-risk areas. It needs to provide adequate support, but it also needs to help the person maintain their stability while allowing them to have their full range of activities. So a newer standard was developed based on recognition of members in the ISO Standards Committee's need for such a measure. So I want to emphasize that these standards are ever evolving, and new standards are being developed all the time based on this really critical input from clinicians and therapists and industry and researchers. And this is one of those examples. So the stability test was developed in large part by the University of Pittsburgh, but with that input. And it takes that same ISO indenter, again, under laboratory conditions with a set load, set geometry, set construction of the indenter, and it applies a load. And that load is applied at the center of the indenter so that it's level, like a normal load. And that's verified to be at 0 degrees of tilt. And effectively, that load is shifted across the indenter to simulate what could be a lean or a reach laterally. And then the angle that that indenter takes is measured. So that gives an indication of how much the cushion might yield to the person while they're leaning, or whether it stays rock solid and provides stability. So this is a new method that's available and should also be considered as all of these tests are evaluated. And I think that's an important point to emphasize too, that each of these tests tells you something about the way that a cushion might behave, but none of them should be taken in a standalone view. They should all be considered separately as you're thinking about what's important for the client and what you're trying to achieve. And the University of Pittsburgh has really been a leader in development of these standards and in promoting what they mean, what the limitations are, what the data looks like, and how they can be assessed in a clinical context. There are a number of resources available at their wheelchair standards site, and this is through the work of Dave Brienza and Tricia Karg and Alex Delazio. So I encourage you to go to their website and learn more about each of these standards, and also watch their presentation if you missed it earlier this week, because they have a large data set and can really demonstrate how the world of cushions that we have available to us might perform differently under all of these different standardized tests and measures. So I'd like to hand the presentation over to my clinical colleagues, first to Endsjo, and she will talk to you about what this means from a clinical perspective.
Yes, thank you, Kara, for that great information. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how you can take the results from those ISO standards and the mechanical testing and use it to help you decide what might be a good product to trial with your clients. And I think one thing to understand, just like Kara said, is that these are independent of each other. Not one test shows you everything about a cushion. So when we talk about this, and we know that product selection for a wheelchair system is not cookie cutter, and there are many, many things to consider, such as past medical history and the client's functional needs, and definitely their personal preference. And even though one product may look fantabulous on paper, if that client just doesn't like that end feel or feels that it's not performing the way that it should, then it's simply just not the correct product for them. And it is critical to trial cushions before making a choice. So when I go through these results, please understand that we're not telling you to purchase one product over another just because it did well on one test, but maybe that's a product that you want to trial first with that client. And I am an occupational therapist myself, and as a therapist, I consider many factors when choosing the right product, like the patient input, and definitely looking at maybe some clinical studies, but most importantly, my clinical reasoning skills. What do I need for this patient? What test of this might be more important over another test while I'm choosing the product for that patient? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at some results and explain what this might tell me as a therapist to assist in my decision-making process. Let's see if I can move this forward. Okay, so this first test that I'm going to look at is contact area. And as a method to help minimize the risk of development or assist in the healing of an existing pressure injury, we know the rule of thumb is the greater the surface area, the smaller the peak pressure. So our goal is to remove a force concentrated in one small surface area and redistribute it over and spread it over the greatest surface area possible. That really will then allow for the reduction in peak pressures. Even if that same force is applied, it's just now being spread out. And we do this by having more contact area made between the user and the seat support that they're using. So this specific mechanical test measured how much contact was made between the seat support and the individual to help me answer the question, is there sufficient pressure redistribution to minimize risk of development or help in healing of an existing pressure injury? And what we would like to see is a cushion that allows for the most contact being made between the user and the seat support in order to achieve the greatest pressure redistribution possible. So here we have tested 3 very high-end quality skin protection cushions. And I think that's important to note. We're not taking some flimsy general use cushion that's, you can buy for $20 at Walmart. These are comparing 3 very high-end coated skin protection products on the market today to see, which one performed better in this area. And we see, oh, I don't know why that went. Sorry, guys, let's back up. Didn't mean for that to go forward. One second. Okay, sorry about that. So we see that when we look at this test result, cushion A and B made 16 and 14% less contact than cushion X. And since cushion X made more contact between the user and the cushion, this information helps me to see that the pressure is being spread out more evenly through the tissues with cushion X and is not localized at some high-risk area while using this particular cushion. So as a result, it may indicate to me that there's less risk for a pressure injury to develop or to help me heal a pressure injury at that particular site. And this actually goes hand in hand with the 2019 clinical practice guideline, where they made some good practice statements, specifically 7.1, 7.11, 7.3, and 7.15, where they recommend using a support surface that has adequate pressure redistribution built in with high-risk clients. So by using a cushion like cushion X with higher contact area being made, you are able to achieve better pressure redistribution. Okay, so the next mechanical test is the immersion test. And as Kara mentioned, this is the only test that has a true pass-fail marker. This test reveals just how deeply the body is sinking into a cushion and really lets us know if there is sufficient immersion available to protect bony prominences to be considered as a skin protection product and coded that way. And in order to be coded as as a skin protection cushion here in the US, there must be 40 to 45 millimeters of immersion to be considered adequate for skin protection. And I think it's very important for us to understand that manufacturers themselves perform this test for immersion for self-certification. And then they submit whether they've met that mark, whether they've passed it, and then they are then coded for skin protection. And I'm not saying that any one manufacturer is trying to be dishonest, because I don't think that's the case at all. I think everyone's trying to be honest. But if they don't have the appropriate equipment or the setup isn't exactly like the standard says it should be, then maybe the results could be skewed. And actually, the results that I'm going to share is a perfect example of this. So again, these are 3 cushions that are on the market today, all coded for skin protection. But we can see that when a third party came in with the appropriate setup, non-biased, and they tested these 3 cushions, it was actually evident that cushion A and B, in fact, do not meet the US requirement based on the ISO standard for skin protection and actually lack 6 millimeters of required immersion, and then probably should not be being used as a skin protection product. Whereas cushion X has 13 millimeters above that benchmark for passing for immersion. So when considering how they've tested, it would be a better choice as a skin protection product for an at-risk client. All right, the next test I'm going to look at is the shear test. And this reveals the potential of the cushion interaction with the body to distort or deform the tissue. And what I'm trying to see is if the cushion in question has shear reduction properties built in that allows the skin and soft tissue to actually move with the bony prominence instead of against them, okay? And after the testing was done, it revealed that the shear forces on cushion A and B increased significantly with movement, indicating that there was probably more tug on the soft tissue and the possible risk to skin and soft tissue damage with those cushions. While there is very little change on cushion X, indicating less stress and strain to the soft tissue because the skin and soft tissue, again, are moving with the bony prominence instead of against it, and again, may be a better choice for that at-risk client. And then the last test I want to talk about is that newer test that reveals two things: the stability in a cushion, when you're simulating a lean or a reach, and then as they're leaning, it actually measures the counter pressure coming back up from the cushion when the client goes into that lean. But this is where it's really important for us to use our clinical reasoning skills. And this is one of the tests that I think that a therapist should really put into perspective, depending on who the client is, what that particular client's needs are, and this test should be put into context. And so I'm going to give an example. So let's say that I'm dealing with a very active user, and this active user, leans over, is reaching to get something out of a closet or out of a cabinet, whatever. And when they lean, they may only be leaning for 5, 10, 30 seconds at a time. And then they have the ability to come back to midline on their own. So let's say they have a cushion, and when they lean, the tilt angle is pretty low, which means that cushion's pretty stable. So that's what I really want for this active user, that this cushion won't really collapse under them as they're performing some type of task. Now, let's say that same cushion has a little bit higher of an upward counter pressure. That's not as detrimental to me with this client because, again, they're only going into that for a very short period of time. Now, let's take that same cushion and put it into a different context. Now, let's say that I'm dealing with a nursing home patient or someone in a hospital where they're not leaning maybe to perform a functional task, but they start to lean because of fatigue or trunk control. And as they go into that lean, they actually need someone to come in and physically take them back to midline. And the problem with that is when they lean, maybe they're not just sitting in that lean for 15 to 30 seconds, but maybe 2 hours or 3 hours. So the fact that that cushion is more stable is not quite as important to me as what is that counter pressure. So let's say they lean and that same cushion has a very high counter pressure, upward pressure coming back from the lean. That is more detrimental to this type of client because they'll be sitting in that position for hours versus seconds. So again, we have to understand the context and really use our clinical reasoning skills to see what is more important to me in this test. Now, in a perfect world, our objective would be, to look for something that has a lower tilt angle, so it's more stable, and also has a lower counter pressure, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these results now. And on the left-hand side of the screen looks at the tilt angles. So we can see that cushions A and B, C, and D actually have higher tilt angles, which means that it's tilting more, saying that the cushion is not quite as stable. Whereas cushion X has a lower tilt angle, meaning that it doesn't collapse under the patient as much. It doesn't give when the patient leans. Now I want you to focus on the graph on the right-hand side of the screen. And what that is, again, looking at what is that upward counter pressure as the person goes into a lean. And here you can see that cushions A, B, and C have a very high counter upward pressure, while the upward counter pressure from cushions D and X are more comparable and significantly less. So during a lean, cushion X showed to be more stable and had less counter pressure, which again may indicate better pressure redistribution and more stability when someone's going into an active reach, which we know having less counter pressure and better pressure redistribution is a major factor in pressure injury prevention. So again, cushion X might be the better cushion to trial with my patient first. And now I'm going to take it over to Stacey.
Right, thank you, Anna. Let's see if I can change the slide. It is not changing for some reason.
I can advance it for you.
Okay, thank you. All right. CARE has done a great job outlining the standards and mechanical bench testing, and Anna has shown us how standardized bench testing and clinical reasoning can be used to find the best solution for a client. And I want to talk more about clinical reasoning and how some common misconceptions can get in the way of our appropriate product selection. So clinical reasoning is what we do in our day-to-day practice when we're face-to-face with a client. We're evaluating their overall status and determining what goals need to be met for the most favorable outcomes. But when talking about choosing a seat surface or cushion, there are a lot of misconceptions in daily practice. I know because I've heard them and I've believed some of them myself. And this is where looking at these standardized bench tests can help. By understanding the performance of a cushion on the different standardized bench tests, I can gain some key information to help determine if a product will meet my client's goals. And let me give you an example. One misconception that I've seen over and over in my years of clinical practice is clinicians choosing a cushion based on the stage of injury and matching that with a particular medium. So the first problem with this is we should always consider the client as a whole and not just their pressure injury. We need to look at their balance, their strength, range of motion, the places that they sit, whether that's the wheelchair, car, recliner. You get the point, and what they need to be able to do in their wheelchair, right? So we look at their function, and each individual with a stage 4, for example, pressure injury doesn't necessarily have the same lifestyle, physiological makeup, and therefore won't have the same seating goals. It's like Anna has already said, there are no cookie cutter solutions because we're all unique individuals. So thankfully we have guidance like the NPIAP clinical practice guidelines and the wheelchair seating pocket guide that clearly outline the risk factors for pressure injuries. Well, now we have these ISO standardized bench tests that show us that multiple mediums of cushions can perform exceptionally well, depending on the quality and the construction of the cushion. And as you heard from Anna, each test can give us more information about how a cushion might perform in multiple areas. And so I'm going to use, for our misconception, I'm going to use foam as an example since it can often be perceived as the least effective for skin protection. Now, if we move to the next slide, foam cushions, they often get a bad rap. And I've heard several clinicians in my own practice throughout the years say that they won't use a foam cushion if someone has a pressure injury. And there's the assumption that gel or air will provide more skin protection. So this is interesting. The tests that Anna walked through just before me were all of a foam cushion versus gel cushion. And in every single test that Anna described, she said that cushion X performed better than the others. And cushion X was actually a foam product. So the foam product outperformed the gel. The other cushion was a gel product. So based on these tests, I may have thought that I wouldn't trial a foam cushion for my client, but as I look at the performance of these cushions on these tests, I may decide to trial that particular foam cushion over the gel cushion. And, that assumption that foam is bad kind of gets blown out of the water. And this is why we need to work as a team. when it comes to deciding which seeding products might be best, we need to utilize each other's expertise. And I know this topic has come up a lot in these past couple of days, and it's just so important. Now, usually the therapist has done an evaluation and has determined the goals and the needs for the client. And the therapist brings in the supplier to help determine what products will be most appropriate to meet the goals. And I'd like to encourage everyone to remember that as we continue working towards evidence-based practice, manufacturers should be following suit. In the past, I think we've all seen this, some companies making claims about products without really being able to validate the claims. And I think these times are passing us by. Things are changing as more and more of us as clinicians and consumers, we want to see the evidence for those claims. This is where the testing that Kara and Anna discussed fall on the shoulders of the manufacturers. Kara mentioned that these are not required tests, but I just shared the example of the misconception that foam is bad. A marketing claim that may have led to that kind of misconception could be something like, you know, I'm totally making this up. Gel provides superior skin protection than foam due to greater immersion and contact area. Yet the testing that Anna shared showed that a particular foam cushion performed at the top of the pack above gel cushions in the standardized bench tests of immersion and contact area. So this gives me more data as a therapist to think outside my box and possibly trial a foam cushion that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. So my point in saying all this is to encourage manufacturers to do this mechanical testing, to back up claims that are made about products. And I also want to encourage therapists to ask manufacturers who are they're a valuable part of the CRT team, and ask them for evidence for the claims that they make. Because this testing, the more we encourage that, the better our industry will be in terms of outcomes, and we can provide better solutions for our clients. So let's continue this accountability and commitment to evidence-based practice and encourage companies to test their products and make claims with evidence to support them. So this brings us to the end of our presentation, and we hope that you can see how the clinical guidance that we have from the NPIP guidelines and the seating pocket guide, along with the standards and mechanical testing results, all tie in to our clinical practice. And then how all of these, if you can go to the next slide, Kara, how all of these together get us to that sweet spot that we all want, which is that evidence-based practice. And this is where we've gathered and used all of our resources and are able to find the best possible solutions for our clients. So thank you for attending. We have a few minutes now to answer questions that people might have.
Kara, I'm going to read this out loud for you, and I'll let you take this one. It says, how many independent ISO testing labs for wheelchair cushions are there in the United States?
That's a great question. There are several, and actually a great resource for that is through, first of all, the RESNA standards committees. We list all of the independent test labs that we have access to here in the US. And then internationally, the International Society of Wheelchair Professionals has created a website that lists all of those locations throughout the world and even ties them to the specific tests that they provide.
I don't see any other questions.
Thank you. So just in case, I will be providing the CEU code, and maybe we can continue with the questions right after that. So thank you everyone for attending this session. As promised earlier, the CU for this session is 9O, V as in Victor, 88M. I will repeat, the CU code for this session is 9O, V as in Victor, 88M. I will be sending this code via chat, and please feel free to continue to add your questions in the chat in the meantime. Thank you so much, and I will turn it over to our speakers again. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us, and we're happy to also talk with you after this session and answer any questions that you might have. So please feel free to reach out. Thanks for all of the kind comments. We wish we could be in person, and hopefully next year we will, and we can see you face to face. I think since we don't have any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and close the session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Stop the recording before we close.